Thank you for joining us on yet another Hacker Hangouts and another Saturday morning. And today we are talking about infrastructure as code, which is a topic which I ran from for the longest time because the whole thing just seemed like yet another infrastructure as code, security as code, code as code, or I don't know, any number of the varieties. But Gator has been living and breathing infrastructure as code for I don't know how long have you been like diving into infrastructure as code lately?
I've been with my main employer for the last 4 years, and then before that, I was actually experimenting with it before then to help automate my entire sysadmin. Or my sysadmin job. So probably 6, 7 years at this point,
Okay. And
solidly.
infrastructure as code here, I'll throw us both up on the screen. Infrastructure as code has been like it started out where there was only like one solution, like how most
Right.
technologies start. There's one solution and that's it. And in the thumbnail you saw, which by the way, rather love that thumbnail. There's now
Hilarious.
tons of them. And even worse than that is not only is there like let's use AWS, cloud formation. And we'll get into what infrastructure as code is, what you should be learning and what we should be focusing on. But cloud formation, and then there's like a layer of obfuscation or like extraction from it where you can do like serverless, which then compiles into cloud formation, which then compiles into infrastructure as code. So the whole thing is like super annoying and confusing.
There's so many different levels to it now. It's incredible, Silk.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. It's utterly ridiculous. I love technology, but it gets to this point where it's just like, where do you start? And that's maybe what we're going to talk about. And I think the first piece is, what is infrastructure as code? I know the name, and please don't tell me. Well, it's infrastructure, which you can do as code. Like, what is it? What was the purpose of it?
All right. So my use case and infrastructure as code is making sure that you're able to re-implement something again and again, repeatedly, without having to hand touch it. So that's my long and short of what infrastructure as code is for me. And my
But
journey on that.
what does that
Go ahead.
mean? Like even simpler than that. Like explain it to me like
Even simpler,
like a
if I want to
3-year-old.
install a machine and I want to be able to reliably do that again and again with the exact same specs, that infrastructure as code is going to help me make a cookie cutter template to redeploy that and have the same settings across every single box.
In high level, it's legitimately I open like VS Code or whatever my my YAML file or whatever the format is for that specific technology, and I can
Right.
write I want an Ubuntu server at this version, which is going to have this software and this software and this software, and I write it all out in code.
Yep.
And then
Absolutely.
I effectively say up go, and then it will go out to wherever we'll say my cloud provider is, and go
Sure.
build out that infrastructure. Are,
Absolutely.
is
You
all
can do it there.
infrastructure as code for cloud infrastructure, or can I have
I
like a
would say no.
server at my house and I can say, okay, go deploy like these VMs or something like that?
I would absolutely say it's not just for the cloud. It's for any lab. So that would be your home lab. That would be something that you're building for yourself. It could be even building up your own desktop, right? So when we get a new machine installed or we get a new Mac, get a new laptop, I've gone through and used infrastructure as code to install all my favorite programs and all of my configurations because Lord knows I don't like things just the same way out of the box. There are tweaks that you want to go through and do. So that's
Okay.
what I implement infrastructure as code as. So yes, basically automation from what Sim and Brandon are going through and saying in chat.
Well, that's excellent. For some reason, my chat disappeared. Ah, there it is. Hey-oh. I am a professional. I know what I'm doing.
We're doing this live. It's
Absolutely
fun.
not. What's interesting about infrastructure as code is one of the things you just talked about is you can do it for like workstations. I've always like
Yep.
my experience for infrastructure as code goes into one of two. Usually like application development or like application security pipelines and things like that
Right.
for deploying my code and making it easier. And we'll get into some of that. But you talked about like actual workstations. So like employee onboarding. We're getting a new employee, like here's their laptop. Okay, like boom, push, and then it just sets up the system.
Right. And so that's how infrastructure as code is the larger name for that. Automation is the simpler name for it. Because my background came from, hey, I was a cabinet maker going into IT, and then I started with sysadmin work. So I was doing that for mom and pop shop for a long time, did that on Windows. I was always interested in that Linux thing and was always installing it and wiping my homework on my personal machine. So you had to have really good backups. But you learned over time that, hey, grub overwrites things if you're not careful. When it came to the first jobs of actually doing it full time, I had the older sysadmin sit me down and says, okay, so this is how I do our Snowflake boxes. And we went through the installer for whatever Linux distro you're using at the time. And I'm like, okay, all right. I'm writing each step of this down because I didn't know at the time that there was something, at least for like RHEL distributions, Oracle, Linux, CentOS, and such, that there's a Kickstart file. I learned over time, oh crap, instead of me having to hand click each one of these boxes to install at the beginning, I can then see this file at the end and then put this answer file, is what Windows would call it, and be able to rebuild this box again and again without having to go through the GUI. So I was able to really help improve our install time for onboarding new people. Went from, hey, I need to build a machine for a developer, and that would take up to a day. Not even talking about the paperwork that they'd have to sign and get onboarded, but it would take a day worth of hand building before a developer box was ready to be deployed. So to the end of the story. Later on, we'll talk about it.
Oh, no, I was going to say, so what I was thinking about is it seems like it fulfills two major problems. One is quick setup of new systems. We got a new system come in. Here's our corporate image. Instead of imaging the system, this now, like, you sort of like, here's the install guide, we'll say, and here's like the config to go off and do. And that kind of configures it with simple things for Windows. Now, the answer file is just for Windows. Can you also use, so that would be more the workstation side. The other one is like servers. Like, not only do I want to configure the server, where I've used it, and this is the only part I would say fully understand with infrastructure as code, is I have an application. Application isn't crazy complicated, but it's maybe 30 different Lambda scripts, which are like one-off AWS scripts. They kind of like, here's my node file or my Python or whatever it is. Every time it executes, I just want to run the evocation. I want to run that piece of code, and then I want the whole thing to die. That's Lambda. So I have like maybe 20, 30 Lambda scripts. I have a database. I have an S3 bucket. I have a Dynamo table. I have an API gateway. I have domains it needs to attach to, and all of these things need to be configured. And if I had to go in, and this is how the thing started, is if I had to go in and right-click, create S3 bucket, I have to go create API. When I want to set up a new client on our software, I then have to go and do that in every AWS instance. Where with serverless, which is like almost an abstraction layer, which creates CloudFormation, and we'll get into some of the technology, I think, because I think that makes sense. I can write it all in serverless. So now when I want to go deploy all of these different components to a new instance for a new client, I can just like execute it, and it just builds up, and then I don't have to worry about always setting up the database. I can do it as code.
Yep, absolutely. And in that case, what you're probably using a variable by saying company name X goes here, and then it spins up the exact same build that you already had previously. Right.
And it was really cool because it made it so much easier to build like multiple clients. But like, let's pull this back, because AWS has CloudFormation, and that's that's like their technology. They call it CloudFormation. When you want to, format your cloud, is you're going to write it, and it's a really hard language. It's kind of like weirdly XML based. It's not really YAML. You can do it in YAML. You can do it in JSON. It's like, I don't like it. Where like serverless is YAML, and it lets you do it, but you can mostly only deploy in AWS with CloudFormation. So all these other languages kind of exist which convert into it. What ones you had mentioned earlier, like Puppet, like this is yesterday to me. What are some of the technologies that exist for infrastructure as code?
So there's a handful out there. There's still Chef, there is still Puppet, and then there's Ansible. And to be honest with you, there are a lot more when we're talking about like deploying systems. Infrastructure as code is a huge subject, and it also dabbles into the whole containerization, like you said, the serverless. I'm starting to go through, so many buzzwords. Love the buzzwords. Birds? Yes. Love it. The issue is that this is a very deep topic. So I'll talk to what areas that I've gone through, which is more on the infrastructure and building up actual boxes side of the house. So more of the sysadmin. I'm starting to get into the containerization now, dipping my big toe in back from 4 years ago when Docker, and I was learning Docker Swarm too. There was a huge container war on who was going to win and who was going to go through and be the manager that rules them all. And we can talk about that a little bit later on. But for me, I started with Puppet, and because my use case for my developers, they told me that they wanted a standard image install. Because what I found out at the beginning of the job there is that the old sysadmin sat me down, said, "Here's the packages that we install," and then the next day he says, "Hey, we're going to install another machine just like it." And I brought out my notebook, and he installed half of the packages and added 3 or 4 other packages that he didn't the day before. So I'm like, oh no, we're not putting out a standard image across what this developer is expecting to have in work and this developer is expecting to have in work. So by going down that point, finding out that she had a Kickstart file, also called the Anaconda script, if you just install any RHEL-based Fedora, Red Hat, Oracle, whatever, there's something that gets popped into your root folder that's called an anaconda.ks or Kickstart script. You're able to then take that and then point to that and have a machine installed exactly the same way, whether it's partitioning, different programs that are installed, configurations, and the whole bit. So from that process, I started saying, okay, if we want to have this exact same setup, let's use Puppet to force the same configuration files being put on the end machines. So it checks in every 5 minutes, and there is an agent with this, and it gets pushed across the network, and then it's enforced by saying, here's the configuration, which works great if your environment's not moving very often or changing very often. Mm-hmm. But a year and a half to implementation, found out that there's too many snowflakes when it came to different special machines that needed to have differences. So Puppet going through and forcing the update every 5 minutes started screwing up some tests, because the developers then went in at that time. They were privileged. They had certain sudo access, and they would go change shit. And then from there, why isn't it working? Or it was working 5 minutes ago. So I was like, all right, forcing this configuration file across everybody is not going to work. So then we developed a different... Go ahead.
I was going to say, we're going down like a path which is like enforcing Puppet and things like that. I want to get back to some of the basics. Praxius asks, are virtual networking devices considered infrastructure as code? Let me move that over so we can see it.
I would say yes. That's in my opinion. There are much more different professionals in different areas that would say otherwise. Everybody's got their own opinion on this. If you can manage it with code, it could be used as infrastructure as code. So in jumping down the line, I'm using Ansible now. I absolutely love it. It is agentless, so you're able to go through and push things remotely. And Ansible, you can go through and manage not only virtual network devices, but actual network devices, talking about your Cisco's, your whatever else routers. As long as there's an interface that you can get to it via SSH, you can manage it with Ansible.
Okay. So it seems like infrastructure as code, too, very much sits into this. I want to set things up for the initial run, and I want to maintain it going forward. And I like the virtual networking one for me, I think of when for our application within serverless, and there's serverless technology, and then there's actually a technology called serverless. And that's like their language and things like that. It's open source. They have a commercial offering and things like that. But with that, you can set up your networking. You can set up your security groups and your permissions, and you do all that as code. The thing where it becomes a little wonky with the name infrastructure as code is it kind of like it pigeonholes it. There's also there's so many buzzwords. There's security as code, and you can layer infrastructure as code, and then implement your security as code, and then implement your secure DevOps on top. It doesn't have to be necessarily one config to rule them all. You might have multiple of these config files that will lay on top of each other.
Absolutely. I see Gallery's question. If you can program your Google Calendar, does that mean it's infrastructure as code? Does that mean that your Google Calendar is infrastructure as code? Or does that mean that you are able to program your Google Calendar with infrastructure as code? And I would say the second one. If you're able to touch an end device, whether it's an API or something else, you're implementing infrastructure as code.
No. I'm going to disagree with that one. You can't just have, if you code it and it touches infrastructure, it is infrastructure as code. I think it does need to be specific is when you implement code that would build infrastructure or set up infrastructure or maintain infrastructure,
so
things that actually affect the infrastructure.
Right. It's automation versus infrastructure, right? So is it infrastructure as code? No. Are you automating part of that? Yes. So the line between that, so are you building out physical machines, or an end machine is one deal. So,
Like,
okay, I
here,
understand your argument
even
there.
easier. Is Docker Compose infrastructure as code?
Is Docker Compose infrastructure as code? Well, I would
You're
do
building a
pragmatic
network,
code.
you're building volumes, you're maintaining, like, here is my system and here's the applications that are running. Like,
Right.
at a certain point, like,
It's
is just
virtual.
everything
Yep.
infrastructure as code?
That's where it becomes all fuzzy, right? Because at that point is, are you automating your build install and your implementation of that? And where do you cut off that line? So if you're going serverless with the cloud, if you're doing Docker containers or just containerization whatsoever, it gets fuzzy, man. So
All
are
right.
you automating your process?
I'll break us from this one, which comes down to like the purpose of this, because
Yes.
some of the, among all of this is to make make our lives easier and make the companies easier. So like, what is the purpose of infrastructure as code? Like, why was this a problem that we needed to solve?
Because we had inconsistencies, man. Like I was saying, at the early days of my career, on talking about the sysadmin coming in and installing certain packages one day and then the next day not installing other packages. If you're trying to have a consistent platform that you're able to either have the tools that you need or be able to run the code that you need to have that infrastructure set up within the same parameters again and again. And honestly, it's to save time. Like I was saying, early days, it would take us a day to go through and build out a box before it was ready for the developer. Later on in that career, about 4 years in, got to the point where we could go through, plug in a brand new box into a network port, and 30 minutes later, a box was ready for a developer. So we were
Hmm.
able to, over time, show how much time we were saving, and that was unattended at that point. So instead of us having one sysadmin or a junior sysadmin there for a day working on something, we are able to say, slap a box, hit go, and it found the Pixie Boot server, installed everything, and the developer was ready to go.
It sets it up. Is there enforcement built into this as well for any of these things, or is it just initial setup?
So in this case, we are using I'm going to go technical just for a little bit to answer the question and come back out. We were using a Kickstart file to install most of the programs that we needed. And then there were some special ones that needed to be installed post-install. So we had to go through and harden things as well. We are using Ansible to go through and do that. So if you're talking about enforcing, you also had like SE Linux. Depending on what type of enforcing you're talking about doing on, okay, is it stigged? Is it gone through, or is it stigged being hardened? Or are the programs that we want to have the configuration set up to where only the permissions are set? Yes, it does go through and do
Like,
each one of those steps.
can I set it to the point where I want to say like, oh, install Adobe Reader on the set, like build up the system, download Adobe
Right?
Reader, install it, and then
Mm-hmm.
can I force it to say make sure it's always the latest version where it continues to maintain that version moving forward?
Sure. So in that use case, downloading Brave browser for an example, you would go through directly to Brave, grab that repo file, install it. It's going to grab the latest then, and now that's auto going to update. Every piece of software that you have, if it's got a repo, and I'm talking on the Linux side because that's more of my background. If it's got a repo, it's usually going to go through and reach out, find out if there's any new packages, and then it'll keep it up to date and installed.
Well,
Versus,
will it maintain the old systems? Because one of the things, maybe I'll get to my question, which is the
Mhm.
core of the question is, does this solve a compliance problem? Because in compliance, you have, here is the control, here's the policy, here's the procedure. So like the control will say like, we maintain updated systems, or maybe not even that. We will ensure that our systems are secure with periodic updates. Our
oh yeah,
policy will say more specifically, like we maintain periodic updates by installing them at a quarterly cadence and we'll
quarterly,
review it.
weekly,
In the
bi-weekly basis.
procedure, then, would be very specific. We log into each system, we apply this set of patches at this.
Right.
So when you make that image, you would say, okay, this is the image in which we enforce. So the
Right.
question I have is, can infrastructure as code be used to enforce policy, or is it just to set it up? Like if someone tries to deviate, can you get an alert and say, okay, this system's out of sync or something like that?
Right. Absolutely. So back to the whole thing on an agent versus agentless. With Puppet, it would force that every 5 minutes. With Ansible, you need to go through and push that. In our use case, we are going through and doing that on a daily basis, or if there was an update to the system that we needed to push manually, and it would reach out to each one of the end nodes and install that. So
Okay.
yes, it absolutely helps with compliance. In our case, like I said, we had to go through and stig things, and that's a whole thing from NIST that you can go through, download. It's got a bunch of different controls. That's where my background goes to. Oh Lord, we're getting back to this, which is great because I'm so familiar with it. But using OpenSCAP, using Oval, going through and bringing those down, there are different ways to be able to implement that. And absolutely, that's what we are using it for. And in our use case, when we had people come in and validate that, we needed to make sure that it wasn't just which machines. They would usually pick random machines on a sheet and say, hey, go to this machine. We're going to go walk over there. You're going to drive, and we're going to verify that all the settings that are supposed to be hardened via the STIG are done. Okay, great. This one's done. Now let's walk over to this machine too. I'm like, well, I could just... When you tried to show somebody infrastructure as code with Puppet, you're like, oh my, if you're not a Puppet person, you don't know how to read this. Versus some of the newer tools now, you can now look at YAML, which is pretty human readable, and saying, is this hardened? Yes, no. When was the last date it was hardened? X date. And then you can see that a lot easier now that it's implemented across the entire lab that you're orchestrating and that you're managing.
Okay. So like this brings us probably to the next piece, which is there's so many technologies and there's so much of this. Now, there's so many acronyms to see Brandon message them. Yes, there is. If there's one we mentioned that like where you go, like, what the heck are they talking about? Go ahead and just like throw it in chat or just make one up and see if we can define it.
Oh, no.
We'll see if catching it. No, there's way too many of them. So you now have this piece like an auditing, same thing. They're going to pick up a few systems. We're going to go check this one. Now we started talking about YAML and configuration, and you said Puppet and Ansible. And can you just like go through some of the technologies which exist in this field, and probably more specifically, like what is it they do? Like, because I mentioned CloudFormation, that's AWS specific. That's Amazon Web Services. That's that specific. If you want to create infrastructure as code, typically, it will always be done within CloudFormation. And then there's serverless, which translates into that. So you mentioned Ansible and Puppet. What are they? What do they do? Are they open source? Are they paid? Are they commercial? Can you talk through some of the tools?
Absolutely. So I'm seeing a new acronym, HCI. That one I don't know. So if you made that one up, fantastic. High computing? Nah. Anyway.
High compute infrastructure. I'm going to pretend that's it.
Right? Chugging for the 15 seconds. So with that, the side of the Puppet is infrastructure as code, to where it's going through and automating your network to where it's pushing a configuration file. You do have to install an agent. So there is free versions of that, and there are paid for versions of that. Very much like where if you are looking for support, you're going to probably end up paying for that support, versus if you just want to install this for free, you can very easily install a Puppet server and install your Puppet clients on Mac, Windows, OS X, and Linux, no problem. So Mac and OS X, really?
So let's go to Ansible and Puppet. Are they competitors? Do they do the same thing? What is it they do specifically?
So
it's just also Jenkins and stuff like that.
Right. So Jenkins is more of the pipeline to where you're building out a workflow and then it's going through and pushing things down, or here's input of the new build. It goes through the pipeline and then it spits out a new end test case. When you're talking about Puppet and you're talking about Ansible, those are things that are configuration managers that will go through and push any changes, settings, or configs, including installing programs. It can also enforce is SE Linux being security enhanced Linux on all the RPM based distros. That's one of the things that helps secure that operating system. They are somewhat in the same category, but they're used for two different use cases. For Puppet, like I said, you're trying to enforce that all the time. It's automatically being pushed, those updates, every 5 minutes. Ansible is when you want it to. And that could be as often or as not often as you want it to be as well. So that's why it's a human computer interaction is HCI. Nice. Okay. Learning something new each day. So they're in the same realm of configuration management, but they're not necessarily competitors. for the last few years, I've also been going through and switching from Puppet over to Ansible because of the use case that we talked about. Those Snowflake machines needed to make sure that this developer versus this analyst didn't need the same settings. So we started forking things out, and we didn't want to force those changes on the developers' test boxes. So it worked out really well to the switch, along with the onboarding process for learning Puppet for me personally versus Ansible. Ansible was a lot easier, and being able to jump into our community as well for folks who are interested in trying to start to automate. There seems to be a like a stigmatism on, if I automate my job, then I'll be out of a job. And have you gone through and heard this, Silk? Is this something that you've...
I've heard it, and I've given many rants on this topic. I think I just did a video on this rant, but here's the summary of it. This whole idea of automating yourself out of a job is I hate it. I don't use that term lightly. I think it's one of the dumbest things to be fearful of, because I use the analogy. I'll throw myself off on chat. You work at the Hoover Dam. You go in the back room, and there's a hole there, and you stick your finger in, and you go, great, I am now critical path to this, and you stick in another leak, you stick another finger, you stick a toe, and then you are a critical path. You're saving everyone's life in the back room, in a closed room that no one even knows you're there. Not only is that a downfall for the company, because no one is, now you're in a hole, you're fixing all of this, and no one has any idea what you're doing. And at first, it's going to hurt your career, because when a new job or a new position comes along, you're in the back room plugging those holes. They're not giving it to you because you're critical path. They'll hire someone else and give it to them. Where if you build a solution which fixes those holes, not only do you get credit, and it's or heck, train a junior to come in and plug those holes for you. And then all of a sudden it lets you back out. It doesn't make you irrelevant. If you're that employee who can create solutions, replace yourself, solve problems, you are irreplaceable, because now, as like an employer, I can move this person anywhere, and they can continue doing that. They can build a team. They can solve ongoing problems. They can create solutions. And if they can create solutions, I can duplicate those solutions. I'm so far up on my
this is exactly it.
Soapbox, but this is like, you absolutely want to be doing this. So make your job. The best programmers in my mind are we'll say the lazy ones. The ones who go, I have to do this every single day. Why wouldn't I create a script to do this? And then share it with everyone. Not necessarily open source, internal to the company, but this idea going, if I'm critical path, they can't fire me. No, if you're critical path, that's the easiest using the Hoover Dam as an example. That's the easiest person to fire, because one, you're not evangelizing what you're doing, so no one knows what you're doing. And the second part of that is, it's easier because you have so much stored knowledge. It's going to be impossible for me to train someone else. So my best solution, legitimately, is to fire that person, let the mistake now happen so I can see what the mistake is, and then train someone to fix this problem, which has now occurred. It is mind-numbing, this mentality that we are like these weird secret hoarder, like Gollum-like figures in the back room in our basement, going okay, no one can know these things, and it protects me. It's terrible mentality.
Stupid. Absolutely stupid. And unfortunately, the previous employer was exactly that way. That's the entire culture, to where this is my baby. Nobody can have this information. So slowly doling out information over years is like, oh, here's how to do it, or here's how we've always done it. No reasons why, but this is the way we've always done it. And by going through and being that person that goes and documents, and this is, I thought, Silk, when I became a sysadmin, I'd be hands-on keyboard the entire time. I'd be hacking code, building machines, racking, stacking. Oh, this is awesome. And I get to play with real machines versus the cheap ones that I could get at eBay or the thrift shop or whatever else, right? Going from home lab to actually doing this in production. And then to find out that it's stuck together with gum and duct tape, and it's just, no, document what you're doing so then you can have the consistency. And that helps with your automation later on, because then you can also trade that for somebody or train somebody else new coming in.
So bringing this back though, with infrastructure as code, this is what's kind of really cool about it is with applications, you can document them as you're building them. With patches and the gold copy and things like that for the one you copied everyone's system, you kind of have to document that because by just the nature of it existing, it's going to be documenting. Within programming, we've gotten now like things like Open API or Swagger, which is when you're programming your API, it auto documents your posts and your GET requests and your put and patch and all of that. It self-documents. Right. Infrastructure, none of that existed. It kind of been like, hey, when we need a Windows server, it's like, okay, call the infrastructure team. I remember, like, again, when I was at General Electric, it was so weird. We would have to order the infrastructure we needed through another team. Like, what was really weird is, like, because it was a big enough company, you actually had to, like, buy it, like, with
really?
We'll say with fuzzy money, but, like, at the same time, like, you had to purchase it. I got to see exactly how much the server cost was per month on it was really weird. But you would order it. And it kind of like ordered it and then it would disappear. Where infrastructure as code, all of a sudden, it's like self-documenting. It's easily auditable. It's easily reviewed, which I think in some ways like is awesome because self-documenting, documentation is important. But otherwise, isn't this kind of terrifying too? Because there's some security built into inefficiencies. And what I mean by that is like, you have 100 different servers. They're all configured differently. They're all updated at different levels. And at least if I keep those all updated, in theory, there's less vulnerabilities. There's no vulnerabilities. Where if I build infrastructure as code, all of a sudden, like, and I make an issue or a mistake, or I push a registry change that I really didn't want to make, I can hose my entire environment as opposed to just one. Like, is that bad? Like, is infrastructure as code like a terrible idea because now you can hose everything at once?
Sounds like you're pushing it live in production there, Silk. We should be talking about how we should have different test, dev, and prod environments, which a lot of people
no one
tease
ever
about
pushes
by saying,
to production.
Right. I mean, unless it's Friday afternoon at 3 p.m., right? Don't ever do that, folks. Wait, just wait.
I did it yesterday. But that's a whole different story.
If you're able to, and you've got testing and you're comfortable with it, you're in control of that, right? Got to the point where with this employer had no controls, no consistency, and I had to end up becoming a lab manager to where I needed to understand the entire process of if somebody's going to change something on the systems. We got to the point where we had one Linux admin and one Windows admin on the same network that was disconnected from the internet. And then we had 5 other networks we had to manage disconnected from the internet as well. So we're working on special code. It's like, so all the niceties that you can do about just, hey, update from online. No, you had to grab those packages, bring them across the network and install, which really opened my eyes to how easy it is to do our jobs on the internet now, because you can just press update and shit works. But having that air gap network made it more interesting because you had to be able to build it yourself. And it gave me a green field to come in on. I had to learn also not only to be a good sysadmin, but to lab manage, and then learning how to do DevOps. So I think we've talked about it in the past where we've got like the Phoenix project really helped me with that personally. We actually ended up making that part of our onboarding process for the anybody new coming in, whether it was new sysadmins, whether it was folks going through and doing the auditing or making sure our security was up to date. The Phoenix project is great for the story, but then the DevOps handbook was actually getting hands-on and how you implement DevOps in your organization. So the story, if everybody can just read or listen to the story, you can say, hey, don't be like Bob, or don't be like Steve, or you're being a Steve right now. And they can at least have that basis, versus the DevOps handbook was only read by a couple folks, but they were the ones key in implementing like the change control board before we push something across the entire network. There was making sure that we had people coming in and saying, hey, we've got this test running that we cannot break anything on during this window. We're going to have to push any changes to next week. Or we did ours on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So we never push changes on Friday because that caused too many headaches. That was our case and our risk factor.
This comment, and I'm going to read it because it might not show up all on screen. Aircraft navigation systems are often designed with primary from one vendor and secondary from a different vendor, or a completely different product line, no shared code. I've seen this in critical systems before, and it makes perfect sense. And it's not necessarily it's not meant to be a security thing, though there are security aspects here. It's more that, like, if your production has a bug in it, more than likely that's going to exist in staging and dev because it was just discovered in production. So if it's a critical bug, like it causes the system to crash, if you flip over to the failover, it's going to crash when the same event happens. Where there's other times it's done for security, like I think of like physical security. I think I've even used this analogy. I want to get Das Nubis, one of my friends, Matt, who does physical security. He always tells me the story, which is like one of his favorite, which is he does physical security, and it was for a dispensary, like a weed place. And what was interesting was because of the restrictions and money and whatnot, they had to hold their own money. They couldn't do it in a bank, so they had to build an entire vault effectively. But security-wise, he got to design the outside system, and a whole nother company designed the inside system, so that if either company had all their code or all their infrastructure shown or their documentation, then it wouldn't lead to both of the system, both layers getting hit. It's like an onion. There's layers.
Cakes have layers.
What was it?
Cakes have layers.
Cakes do have
parfait.
Goodness. So with that, like, I do think there's value to that. Spinning back, when you do infrastructure and code, it seems like you need to have a more mature process. You can't just go, okay, right now we're running and gunning, opening we need a Windows server, we get up, we set it up, we're going over here, we're setting it up, we're now like have another configuration over here. You kind of have to mature your process to the point where you can have separate environments and test systems, because infrastructure and code seems like you can make bigger mistakes with less effort, like at
scale,
one line.
Right?
If you gain scale with infrastructure as code, you can scale your mistakes a lot faster. Is that correct?
Oh yeah, that is 100% correct. So the whole idea with the DevOps process and the whole DevOps versus DevSecOps, I think is a wash, man. It's just, let's talk about devs. Yeah, right? Everybody says it different. We're supposed to be bringing security in from the beginning. So security needs to be part of it, period. I don't care where you put it in the acronym. And yes, you need to be able to make sure you don't just have one production network that you're pushing live. In our use case, we ended up having one or two developers, one developer and one analyst who said, hey, I'll be your test case. Give me the code early, give me the new update early, and I'll check to make sure I can do my job completely without it breaking anything. So it was very simple to where we had a couple systems dedicated to somebody testing that was early on. And we ended up implementing to where we could either reinstall their machine with the previous settings. And obviously we're controlling our infrastructure as code and our automation with our own self-hosted Git. So whether it's GitLab, if you want to have the nice pretty GUI, if you're connected to the internet, you could go GitHub or GitLab, or just host your own Git file or Git server. Nice thing is with GitLab was that the developer was able to see all the changes that they were making. The manager could come over and see a nice GUI and see what we were making versus just a Git server. So yes, have a dev, have a test, and have a prod. If you can only get away with two, don't just push to prod. Do a test and do a prod, because it's going to save you some headaches to where if you fat fingered something, you've got a test case to where you can easily roll back, or if you can go through and fix it on one or two single machines, that's your environment to test with. Some folks, when it comes to like using Jenkins and whatnot, or using the GitLab runners, will go through and do that on a small machine in the corner or a Raspberry Pi in a home lab before pushing it live to production out on the web or whatever else.
One of the things that was terrifying to me when I first started doing serverless infrastructure as code was things, because of the conversion to CloudFormation. At one point, I was like, you know what? I want to rename my Dynamo table. and just name it something else. And what was terrifying early on is I just wanted to like rename it. So it makes sense. Okay, I go into the config, I rename it. And what ends up happening though is it gets translated over to CloudFormation, and CloudFormation goes, oh, you removed this old one. Delete all the data gone. Here's a new one created with a new name. And what's interesting to me is like infrastructure as code for the most part doesn't care about your thoughts or feelings, or like this is probably in general, but you can do some massive damage with even like we'll say a spelling mistake. And
Yes.
I wish there was protections built in, and maybe there is in some languages for you could do a PR request. And this is why I think it is worth doing like Git or something like that, where you can do a pull request, you can protect your master branch or you protect your main branch. You have different branches for different environments. But like this little mistype completely dorks your environment. And it can also, like with things like CloudFormation, it can completely hose all your backups. Like if you build your backups within the same CloudFormation script and you mess up one thing, it might rewrite all of that and rip it away. And it's where it started making me realize you almost like for us, we have our backups in a completely different AWS like account, like fully separated, so that and then you only have write permissions. You have no delete privileges or anything like that. But like infrastructure as code terrifies me. Like
it can
on such an extreme level. Especially especially when it comes to like typically a lot of our pen tests lately, we always say developer environments are the worst. They do the most work. Well, I want to say they don't do the most work. Again, this is okay. Well, it probably most works changes. Out. It's probably everyone watching this stream is within technology. So yes, we all do the most work. No, okay. But what we find is because they're the ones like infrastructure as code, whatever system's running it kind of needs the keys to the kingdom. It has to be able to spin up servers. It has to be able to overwrite things. It has to be able to create users or remove users. Like the permissions are pretty much like you have God rights in a Jenkins server. More often than not, our common entry during pen tests has been these systems. Because if we get into these, like Jenkins, if you have access to the script interface without authentication or with a low privileged access, I can write scripts to pull all the environment variables. Oftentimes, those store passwords and keys. Like they're not supposed to be in your code, but they can be in environment variables. And all of a sudden, like your pen tests escalate with these systems. Like in some ways, yeah, it's more organized, but it's terrifying because not only can you hose one system, you can hose all of the systems
very quickly, right? If you own the right boxes. And at that point, that's where the whole DevSecOps is that, hey, yeah, if you're building on your main machine and somebody gets access to your developer machine, are you keeping your secrets in plain text? And yes, are we doing the most work versus doing the most important work? Absolutely. What's the most useful of your time, right? And that's where the whole automation and infrastructure as code comes in. Get to the point where you're doing the things that are most important for your time versus just filling your day.
Going back to it, you were talking about the security aspects of it.
The problem is that if developers and or sysadmins, let's be honest, because when we're going through and writing this, whether it's a honest to God developer or a sysadmin writing this code, if you're keeping your secrets in plain text on the machine, you're doing it wrong. And if Silk gets onto my box and then is able to go through and change everything on my entire setup because I didn't put that inside of a vault or inside of an encrypted file, that there's a whole bunch of different ones out there. So like there's a favorite one from like HashiCorp that is a special vault. Ansible has its own vault. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say, I'll take exception to so many of these things because like the one we all know you're not supposed to do is hard code passwords. Like we just know you're not supposed to. No. So, but like the moment you go into any of these cloud providers though, like environment variables, they say, do it environment variables. But like, let's say Lambda, use Lambda as an example. Again, it's kind of like, it's a one-off you run. For anyone who doesn't know Lambda, it's I want to execute this one time and then I want to kill everything else. I don't want Docker to run. I don't want a server to run. Just like evocation one time.
I mean,
So
it's
look
running
there.
like what, 5 seconds and you're done.
Yeah, you can run them up to like 15 minutes. I think they've expanded it, but most time you should be running it. It's running pretty quickly, and then it's cutting off. The thing is, though, they go, you talked about secrets manager and things like that. And in AWS has two. You can do the parameter store, you do the secrets manager. And then you have scripts to go off and get it and decrypt them and all of that. But here's where it's like the catch-22 on this. In one way, it's not hard-coded, so it's not in your repos and everything like that. You put in the environment variable, well, all of a sudden, there has been many, many vulnerabilities that have affected it where you can say, steal environment variables, print an environment variable, do template injection and print it out. Like all of these things which can pull them out. But then you go, okay, the best way to do this is Secrets Manager, which costs like $2 per parameter. And then like, it's not much. It's like 3 cents per 1,000 evocations. So like, it's not much, or whatever it is. But here's the problem. You go, okay, my SQL in my evocation, I want to make a connection to a database. Okay, so I need a username, I need password, I need the host. I'm going to put that, if I put it in the handler, now this is getting a little technical, if I put it in the handler, every time it executes, I'm opening a new connection. So you go, okay, well, if I put it in the handler, I can run the go get my secrets and then insert them in there. But the only way I can execute that go get secrets is in a handler or maybe outside the handler, but then the connection has to happen in the handler. So now the problem is every time it runs, I make a new database connection. What's the attack? What can I do? I run that thing 1,000 times. Guess what? I fill up all the connections. That's normal activity. So now all of a sudden, what's my solution? Either A, move my passwords into environment variables, or B, what? Environment variables, or I have to make a connection, open a vulnerability to my server. AWS notices this, and this is what frustrates me with infrastructure and code and all this all these newfangled advancements and their young kids and their technology.
The clouds.
AWS noticed this problem, and they're like, well, people want it secure, and we want to sell more, and we can't do evocations, we can do connections. Okay, know what we'll do? We'll come up with a new product called RDS Proxy, which will magically handle all these extra connections for you, so you can save a little bit of money and do secrets. It is now technology on top of technology on top. Solutions for a problem that didn't exist until these things happened. And I feel like we're hitting that point. So spinning it back around with infrastructure as code, we're now doing, in some ways, you can do like semgrep on your infrastructure as code. That semgrep is a regex for security for code. So what you can do is it will do, like, here's a simple one. It will look for any variable name with the word password in it and say, is a string stored to that with regex? And it will grep through the entire code. It will find that and then flag it as a vulnerability. It's kind of cool, but it's built for that. We can do that for infrastructure as code now, but security hasn't caught up to the new technologies. So now there's not really a great way of securing your infrastructure because now it's all code. Like, as it exists right now, we have like Nessus scanners and Qualys scanners and infrastructure like that. But how long do you think we're there yet where security can, like, we have automated security in infrastructure as code?
Oh, Silk, no. We're not there. So in some areas, this is where so I'm starting to pivot a little bit from the platform TAM that I've been installing things and doing the automation side and going more into the containerization side because, hey, it's the new hotness. I specifically wanted to go into the security side of it. Oh my God. It is a disaster. When we're talking about what standards are out there at this point as well, by saying, hey, are we looking at the code that's running? Are we looking at the code at rest? Or when it's being built up? And you have to have different products for each one of these things, and none of them are perfect. So you can also have huge false flags going through. So just like when we're going back to like our IDS or our firewall or anything else, this takes time and a crap ton of tuning to make sure it's right for your environment. And you're still not going to catch it all, right? To the point that you were saying a little bit earlier as well, is that you were talking about your backups and how it's completely in a separate location. Everybody has to do their due diligence of what is the most important thing in your organization. Is it the code? Is it the results from the code? Is it customer data? And how can you protect and or make sure that's backed up? And have you tried to restore? You should be trying to restore often, because if you do that infrastructure as change, whether it's a security related thing to lock down the database, or if you can now go through and only certain people can write to this file server, then you need to test those. And we're a long ways off at this point. Anybody who's telling you that they've got a perfect solution at this point is selling you snake oil.
Well, that's
so beware.
It's true. But I want to go back to something you said when you talked about SecDevOps or DevSecOps or security ops, cyber ops, whatever you want to call it. And you said security needs to be baked in from the start. And at the same time, we've also talked about test-driven development. And ultimately, how test-driven development works is if I want to create my hello world, like I want to create a application which says hello world, I don't create the application which says hello world. I create first a test case which says this should print hello world. And then I go and create the software which is go print hello world. So when I now compile it and run it, it goes, did it do what you said you wanted it to do? And does it do? Here's the kicker. That is a giant pain in the butt to write that way.
Oh yeah.
And it completely hampers innovation, because all of a sudden you can't go, I have an idea, I'm going to create that idea. You go, wait, no, I need to create a test case. Maybe very mature models can do that. Same thing with security. Like within secure DevOps and things like that, this is the hill I will absolutely die on. Like development needs to do its thing. Security is overhead. Like, I'm sorry, you can try and spin the ROI argument all you want. You're probably making it up unless you're like a consulting company or things like that. When you are doing secure DevOps, right now, most DevOps are doing nothing. Anything, there's like a phrase I use all the time. You're doing nothing. Anything above nothing is something. Let's go off and do something. It doesn't matter if it's SemGrep, it doesn't matter if it's dash scanning, it doesn't matter if it's anything. Because here's the truth with all of these technologies. Most of them, we have zero way of securing them when they're new. We haven't built the tools, we haven't built the solutions or anything like that, and we kind of have to embrace something Gowrie said, it's all broken forever. The end.
Right.
Like we lose. Like, I don't mean we're building it. It doesn't mean like you give up or anything like that. I'm strictly saying like, we do need to come back to reality and say security won't come first. It shouldn't come first. Like, as a business perspective, I know we all have that dream sometime. It's not going to happen because guess what? Security doesn't pay the bills unless you're... I'm sorry, I went on a big rant.
Okay, all right. To your point, the security should be brought into the table at the beginning. It's not always going to be 100% secure. And that's where so many people get hooked up on, oh, is it secure? Nothing is ever completely secure. If you turn out a pen tester on something for a long enough time and feed them enough money, or you have an advanced persistent threat, it doesn't matter. It's time, level of effort, and money.
We're hitting that. And I think we can accept that. We can accept it will always be vulnerable. It's always broken, like given enough time, money, or resources. And there's always this balance that needs to be maintained. But infrastructure as code, I do want to ask this, which is, how do you lock down infrastructure as code? You've talked about Ansible, you've talked about Puppet. How do you make this? Because you now have the ability to unilaterally create infrastructure and enforce it. How is security involved in that process? Like, what can I learn as a security person to go, how can I help you with your infrastructure as code? Where do I come in? How do I help?
So in this case, that's where when we had like the validators coming into the previous job, and if your code is available to be looked at. So in your code management software, so if you're using SVN, God help you, Git, GitHub, something, right?
Hate SVN.
Oh, God, I had to support it in the past. Gigantic pain in my ass.
Is it still alive? Just as a question.
It's still alive.
Okay, gosh.
It's still alive.
Right, continue on.
I also, with the SVN and the other side of the house, there's also this whole CMMI. That's a whole nother ball of wax I'm not going to get into. I put a link to it, but it is the capability maturity model integration. That goes into, like what you were saying, planning your tests before you write everything. And it is a gigantic pain in the ass. But there is a framework for it. So SVN lives, yes. Now, back to your question on the security, have them be able to go through and see the code, and then you show them what the code does in test, dev, and prod. This is the issue to where when you get into something that's highly technical and highly specific, that's only built for one piece of solution or software, you have to have an expert in that to be able to tell you, hey, is this secure or is this not secure? Versus where I've been leaning more towards the more generic, I'll lean again on Ansible. It's in a YAML file or yet another markup language, to where you're able to read it. I'm able to grab my wife or my 8-year-old and say, hey, what does this say? It doesn't mean that you can necessarily tell me what it's going to do on the machine, but it's clear language of what it's trying to go through and enforce and do. That, I think, has brought down the barrier for security now to look at it and say, have I hard-coded a password here? Or, okay, I can clearly see you're calling a variable. Is that variable name hard-coded, or is that going off to a vault? And involving those folks in earlier, it's going to help when you're developing this, or when, let's be honest with you, we're always updating this, right? It's not ever solid to where unless you have like a lock-in date and you're only delivering one image, you're constantly having to patch, update, and improve that image as well. So if you don't get security the first time, bring them in, have them look over it, and they're going to be able to give you tips and tricks. And this is where, if you get into more of the programming side of the house, they have best practices that I'm starting to learn as well, that if you're working with a certain language, they're going to have, this is how you should do it, versus this is insecure. And those get developed over time as well.
Yeah, I would take...
Bring in your pen testers.
Yeah, no, it's like one of those things, though. I take it a little bit of exception of this idea of like, pen testers always know, or anything like that. And again, I understand that's not what you're saying, but the idea that, like, again, I've done it, I did it for years, I still do it once in a while and things like that. But like the idea that I'm going to be a PHP, ASP.NET, Node, Python, Perl, Ruby, all of these languages, and on top of that, understand YAML and the XML, and that all of the different languages is completely unreasonable.
Right.
Most pen testers do become a jack of all trades for these languages, and especially if you've done any competitions and things like that, you probably have to understand COBOL at one point. Like any of these languages, like you do need to be well versed on all of them. But I do think it's unreasonable with all these new languages coming out that you should assume, oh, we have a security tester come in, that they know what they're talking about, because a good programmer can easily trick them, and you could write a vulnerability which they won't catch. Layers of obfuscation, things like that. But
best effort, right?
Best effort, and at the piece of this is, again, I think it always feels like we need to push back to basics with this.
Yes.
Is not hard coding. I mean, you look at OWASP Top 10 and things like that. Those vulnerabilities still exist. SQL injection, cross-site scripting, untrusted code, remote file inclusion, local file inclusion, directory traversal. Like a lot of it's like filtering input in, filtering input out. When it comes to storing infrastructure as code, it sounds like keeping it secure, keep your secrets where they need to, embrace that technology, whatever one you're using, whether it's Ansible or Puppet. There is secure ways of holding your variables, follow those best practices type of thing. If someone wants to get started in infrastructure as code, they want to set it up on their home lab. It seems like when you've talked to me in the past, you can do this with like a Raspberry Pi. What would you recommend as a cheap, inexpensive way of doing this? Like relatively inexpensive way of doing this. And what technology would you push someone to say like, hey, this is the one you should start with?
So you can do it all for free. So I started with Puppet. The learning curve was steep on that. That was also for making sure things are going to be static. I'm going to suggest, and I've helped other folks get started with Ansible. Ansible is free. You can install it on any Linux and or Mac operating system. You can do that if you're going to do the whole Windows with Linux overlay. But if you have yourself a Raspberry Pi or an AWS box or DigitalOcean box, just whatever your package manager, so like yum install Ansible, or if you're running Raspberry Pi or the Raspberry Pi OS, which is based on Debian, do an apt install Ansible. And then you can get up and running. All the documentation is available for free online. And the awesome part about using a community tool like that is that you don't have to write what's called a playbook. Somebody else has already done it. You can download their code change your parameters to say Gator's lab to Silk's lab, and then you press go, and then you do an Ansible run your playbook, and then it'll go build your machine, or it'll install your new desktop. So I will be happy to go through and drop some links on that. I'll also do like a getting started video to where, hey, up and running in like 10 minutes with Ansible, because that's where I think it's super powerful. And when you start thinking about how you can go from installing your favorite programs on your desktop so you don't have to go through and click everything, versus if you want to spin up let's say a CTFD instance up in DigitalOcean, you can do that too. It's up to what you want to go through and write, and the examples of codes that you can find online. So I'd say Ansible costs you nothing, and you can get it up and running as long as you have access to a Linux box.
Okay. And a parting shot to you is the question is this critical path? If you want to go into infrastructure or IT, is infrastructure as code critical path at this point?
All right. I'm going to get on my soapbox just a little bit here. So my employer being Red Hat, they're betting that on their second system administration certification. Yeah, the Red Hat Certified System Administrator, where you're touching everything by hand. The next level is the Red Hat Certified Engineer, and it's only Ansible. So Red Hat is seeing infrastructure as code and automation being the way of the future, to where they changed the RHEL 8 certification to say, if you're a sysadmin, you need to know infrastructure as code. So on that use case, I would say that's what my employer is doing. I can see the use case of it because of my past, that I could have saved myself a crap ton of time if I would have learned that sooner. And that means that I'm able to go do now more interesting things. So my goal is to replace myself with 2 small scripts so I can go do something more interesting now.
With that, where do you leave us? What's the parting shot that you have for us?
So jump in, have fun with it. If you have any questions on it, you can go into the Hacker Hangout Discord chat, or into the Darknet Discord chat as well. And we've got different Linux user groups that are there. If you have questions, a lot of us are going through and using different infrastructure as code. So come ask questions if you get a hang up. Otherwise, you'll see a video drop on my YouTube channel that has been slowly going.
Have you gotten it up at this point?
So I have multiple at this point, Silk. And that was my hang up, is that identity-wise, I've still tried to keep different things separated. But the problem is that it's all different aspects of Gator. My day job is one aspect. My hacker persona is another aspect. And then the makerspace is another aspect. So I've been posting more to the sysadmin side of the house. But I will go through and cross-link those to where there's going to be one on the Gator site that I'll drop.
And we'll definitely, I will update the description below to make sure we have that. With that,
cool deal.
Thank you, Gator. What do you got for us as we close up?
I just lost audio, but that's okay. So I want to say, hey, I love being able to spend this time with you in the mornings. Make sure to go love your hacker family, and I look forward to seeing everybody at DEF CON and online.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us on another Hacker Hangouts. Very much appreciated. Thank you, Gator, for spending the time with us talking about infrastructure as code. As always, thanks for watching, and hack on.